In the Middle East, and particularly in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the high-tech-fueled crypto, artificial intelligence, and FinTech influence has continued to grow. Some have speculated that the wealth and innovation created from those industries could eclipse that of the oil industries that define the region. Every day, it seems, new announcements from the Middle East show a tendency to portray an atmosphere that's friendly to tech companies, both startups and entrenched power players. Yet the momentum of those crypto, AI, and fintech entities are about to go up against another force. That's the upcoming US presidential election. I'm Cody Combs, and on this edition of Business Extra Podcast, we're going to take a look at what a potential victory for Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris and what a potential victory for Republican nominee Donald Trump might mean for the lucrative tech sector of the Middle East. Given his insight on the topic, we'll be speaking with Sam Blatteis, Chief Executive of the MENA Catalysts, a market entry firm for Web3 multinationals expanding in the Gulf economies. He's going to share with us what he's hearing from all those companies hoping to capitalize on technology excitement throughout the Middle East. Again, thanks so much for joining us, Sam. First and foremost, the status quo. You have the Biden administration. How has the Biden administration's policies on crypto, finance, trade affected the fintech and crypto companies in the Middle East?
Yes, let's answer those systematically. One, on crypto, there are lawsuits, court actions occurring against most of the largest crypto exchanges in the United States today. And insiders have described, a number of them have described the current SEC approach as almost a jihad against the largest exchanges. And that is objectively expanding incentives for companies to migrate to less regulated, more pro-business geographies. I'd say especially on fintech, but on a range of other high-tech sectors. Right now, there are a range of M&A deals that are not happening because there are many concerns about the FTC. And also, on the other hand, there are a lot of tax breaks that Trump is promising and a much more modern pro-tech approach that are being offered or being floated by the Harris campaign as well.
Yeah, the only certain thing in the weeks ahead, there's going to be a lot of conjecture back and forth, is that Joe Biden will not be on the ballot. For the most part, U.S. voters will be choosing from current Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Donald Trump. That'll be the choice. What about Kamala Harris? You know, she's from tech-heavy California, a lot of time there. You would think on paper that she would be very into this, pro-crypto, pro-fintech, all these things. There's no sign to point that she's not, but I think Democrats overall have taken more of a cautious regulatory approach to this. Is that wrong?
That's largely fair. She's not a continuation, though, of Joe Biden. Sometimes you've heard the expression, personality is destiny. And she has been having a number of policy dialogues with the high-tech sector and specifically in the Web3 digital assets world in the last several weeks since becoming the Democratic nominee. And she would probably, there's a reasonable chance that she would have a more moderate approach toward the digital assets world. And she's not a continuation of Biden. She is a bit less hawkish on tariffs, on trade than Donald Trump. She's also fluent in a number of areas in the high-tech world that will transform fintech and digital assets. For instance, on AI, where she's been chairing the White House Cabinet Committee on AI for some time.
That's very interesting. So if I'm hearing you correctly, this is definitely not going to be just, Biden 2.0, but during Donald Trump's first term in office, AI wasn't a factor too much until the very, very end of it, but crypto was. We've seen him address various crypto conferences recently, saying there's too much regulation in the U.S. But what do you make of his stances overall and how it'll affect fintech, crypto companies in the Middle East if he should be elected again?
Right now, there's simply very few IPOs occurring. M&A in the States has been a bit hard, and whether it's Biden or Kamala, there's prospects for higher taxes. A Trump would reverse each of these factors. His winning might loosen financial regulations, expand global tech markets, make it easier to do business in the Gulf. And I think a Trump win fundamentally might encourage deregulation and faster market entry for fintech and Web3 companies. That's what I'd say.
Back in April, you wrote an opinion piece for us at The National in which you said, in a nutshell, that the UAE had become a global crypto hotspot amid a regulatory winter. Going into this election, is that something that do you sort of still stand by that? Do you still see that climate in the UAE, or has it changed a little bit?
I would argue that in fact, it's probably accelerated on multiple levels as measured by number of companies moving there. I mean, the regulatory winter in the States, it's not receded. And I would say, yeah, with the expansion of MiCA, it's kind of the GDPR for crypto based out of the European Union that's rapidly becoming a global standard. The GDPR is the kind of the data protection rules of Europe. So the regulatory winter is creeping, and we're seeing more and more. It's remarkable that the UAE now has roughly about as much foreign investment it's attracting into it as Saudi Arabia, except the UAE is roughly a third of the population. And I think, tying it back to the topic at hand, look, if Trump wins, it'll be most people from the right to the left in the digital assets world are quite bullish. If Kamala wins, it expands incentives for people to come to business-friendly geographies like the region. It'll also be easier for Chinese companies, I think, in the Gulf if she becomes president, partly because she's been quite critical when she was her own candidate of Trump's tariffs approach, and even in the most recent debate. And the reason this matters for the crypto world in the Gulf, the two largest crypto companies in the GCC by market share are both Chinese. A lot of people may not realize that.
I do want to talk about China a little bit because that's where it gets really, really interesting. The US obviously wants to keep a competitive advantage in fintech, crypto, and the AI space when compared with China. The Middle East is very open to doing business with China, but Donald Trump has not been shy about his feelings about tariffs, things to that extent. What would a Donald Trump victory or a Kamala Harris victory mean for Middle Eastern relations with China?
I think a Trump administration I'd break it down in two ways. One is governments considered adversaries of the United States, their incentives will expand to deepen ties with China. Governments considered allies of the United States, their incentives would expand quite a bit to deepen ties with the Trump administration. The limits or constraints in the relationship may not apply if Trump wins. If you think about in the past, Democrats have called for limiting various parts of Gulf relationships, whether around arms or around when certain human rights perceived thresholds were crossed. The Democrats called for curtailing parts of that relationship. And with Trump, that doesn't really apply. On Kamala, I think you're going to see a less hawkish approach toward China, but I think there's less room for the relationship overall for the U.S. and the Arab world to grow. The one exception to that, a very notable exception, is the UAE, because UAE is the only country that Kamala went to in the Arab world as vice president. She came twice, and that's probably the one country that she singularly has the most personal experience in since becoming vice president in the Arab world.
You bring up a good point with that because I think people do forget that. I remember the definitely the first visit, but people also forget she briefly came here for COP28 a little bit.
Yes, exactly. And I could see a number of areas where the UAE relationship could also flourish with a Kamala Harris administration as well.
I'm not asking you to quote your clients what they're telling you, but I would like to get a big picture look at what are you hearing from some of your clients without mentioning names about, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Concern, optimism, either way? Is there a lot of parity between the two? What are you hearing?
That number one, yeah, there's just a lot of deals that are kind of on the sidelines. More than one. I've had several companies say, look at the landscape in the US. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions that people would like to do but cannot, or they're concerned about regulatory risk around the FTC and Chairman Khan, who runs it, the FTC, meaning the Federal Trade Commission, which is in charge of competition regulation in the United States. And there's not as many IPOs as companies think maybe are merited or are out there compared with the growth we're seeing in US capital markets, which is significant, right? And that also affects the Gulf countries because the US is by far the largest destination. And so they have a stake in this too. But anyway, shortage of IPOs, concerns about tax. A lot of companies are not single issue, they're almost single issue, not voters because companies don't vote, but I mean, that is a major issue that can, directly alter the bottom line of a range of companies and help determine whether IPOs or M&As are beneficial. So the contrasts are significant, and there's a lot of areas where, there's simply a major gap between, or contrast between Trump and Harris.
So, as of the recording of this podcast, there are about 49 days until the U.S. presidential election. Do you have any other thoughts about the reaction from tech companies in the Middle East with regard to potentially Kamala Harris being president or Donald Trump going back to the White House? Implications, ramifications, the good, the potential bad, just to sort of wrap things up.
I think to recap, less overtly hostile to Chinese businesses in the Gulf if Harris wins. I think there's less U.S. pressure on Gulf countries to divest from tech projects with China. That would make it easier for companies in the Gulf to expand AI tech ties, especially governments with China. And it may expand incentives for U.S. companies to deepen ties further in the Gulf if there's a more dysfunctional U.S. government if the Democrats win.
Sam Blatteis of the MENA Catalysts, thanks so much for joining us on Business Extra.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of the National's Business Extra podcast. Be sure to subscribe to Business Extra on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasting content so you can receive the latest episodes as soon as they come out. This episode was produced by Doa Farid and Arthur Edison. I'm your host, Cody Combs, future editor for The National, and thanks so much for listening.